back of the rim. Garnett on the slam. Oh, using Curry way downtown. Oh, what a shot from Curry.
No smooth ad intro today, I just gotta get this out of the way first. Thanks to SeatGeek for sponsoring this video. SeatGeek is the amazing app that provides you with the easiest way to buy tickets for almost any kind of event, which would most likely be sports related for you all. The app pulls tickets from all over the web and has them in one place to make purchasing one for your event really easy, and it also assures you'll be getting the best value for your ticket. While searching for your tickets, each one is ranked with a score from 1 to 100 that lets you know if you're getting a good deal or not for your purchase. On top of that, the app also provides you with the detailed view of what you would see from your seat before you even get there, which is extremely helpful. If you're interested in downloading this app, the links will be in both the comment section and highlighted in the description. If you're still on the fence, consider using my promo code DOM2K to get $20 off your first purchase. For years now, the Eastern Conference has always been seen as the little brother in the NBA, seemingly always home to multiple teams that wouldn't even qualify for the playoffs if it were ranked in a 1 to 16 order. And for a while, there was no end in sight to that fate. But after so many years, it's finally shown signs of life that could have us headed towards a more balanced future throughout the 2020s. For now though, we take time to look at the evolution of the Eastern Conference throughout recent history and examine the story that has been written over that time. The players, the teams, the moves, everything that has taken the Eastern Conference from what it once was to what it's quickly becoming. This is the evolution of the Eastern Conference. The East has only produced 6 champions since the calendar turned to 2000, and some of that is circumstantial. A big chunk of the Western Conference champions since then have been part of a dynasty or something close to it, making it very difficult for any Eastern contender to compete. But the East has also been victim to the power vacuums created by the strongest contenders and players in the conference suddenly falling apart, causing the next best replacement to take their place, which has led to some really woeful stretches. For instance, after Jordan's Bulls disbanded, for a few years, there was just this random assortment of teams filling in that were wildly inferior to the West and mostly the Lakers. So we'll fast forward to the year 2004, where the Detroit Pistons snatched the crown after completing their core with the addition of Rasheed Wallace. These Pistons squads were a collection of hard-nosed team players as opposed to a ton of elite talent, but they'd contend for years to come. For the time, they'd become the champions of a conference that had 2 50-win teams, themselves and the Indiana Pacers. The rest of the conference looked pretty pitiful record-wise. That Detroit team, however, did the unthinkable by dismantling the Lakers, who were hunting for their 4th title since the year 2000. That inadvertently created what was supposed to be the next Eastern superpower when the Lakers traded Shaq to the Miami Heat. In theory, that would have created 3 amazing teams in one conference between them, the Pistons, and the Pacers. But as you can see in a previous video, the malice at the palace prematurely ended that Indiana core, and they were never the same, as that was Reggie Miller's last run. That left only the Pistons and the Heat as the series Eastern contenders for 2005, but Detroit was able to hang on to power by defeating Miami in 7 games to advance to the NBA Finals. The Spurs turned around and beat them in 7, and although the Pistons would remain integral players in the East for the next few years, it would be their last time making it that far. By 2006, the Cavaliers led by LeBron James were just barely creeping into relevance, but still didn't have the roster to be considered as strong as Miami or Detroit. The Nets had also thrown Vince Carter into the mix with Jason Kidd at this time, but they didn't have a finals level supporting cast, and the Wizards with Gilbert Arenas were also a popular team around this time, but more for their names as opposed to success. The Heat would dethrone the Pistons this time and go on to become the only other Eastern champion to that point in the decade, as Dwayne Wade drew the Michael Jordan comparisons that had largely been reserved for LeBron. So in theory, Wade and Shaq would have rode that wave until around 2009, competing for a top spot in the East. Instead, both of them spent much of the 2007 season injured and were nowhere near the team that came back to win 4 straight against Dallas. On top of that, the Pistons made a major mistake by allowing Ben Wallace to walk to the Bulls that summer. Their final contract offer to him was 4 years, $48 million. Meanwhile, Chicago offered him $60 for that same amount of time. With those 2 events, here's where you can start to see the first resemblance of the power vacuum that was mentioned earlier. Up to that point, the Pistons had been to 4 straight Eastern Conference Finals, which hadn't been done since the Bulls in the early 90s. Without Ben Wallace, who was not only the heart and soul of their team, but also the teeth of their interior defense, they didn't have that same edge that had taken them so far for so long. Thus, with the Heat injured and losing in the first round, and the Pistons losing their championship identity, a Cavaliers team that is widely regarded as one of the worst finals teams ever was able to advance to the NBA Finals where they were no serious threat to the Spurs, who were working on their 4th title since 1999. Also worth mentioning, the Cavaliers and Pistons were the only 50-win teams in the conference that year, with the Pistons topping out at 53 wins. Meanwhile, the West had 2 60-win teams and 5 50-win teams overall. That made it very well understood that the Western Conference Finals were the real NBA Finals that year. However, the power vacuum in the Eastern Conference did not last for long. The Boston Celtics swung a deal for one of the most aggressive power grabs in NBA history by securing both Kevin Garnett and Ray Allen in the same summer to join Paul Pierce. They immediately became not only the favorites in the East, but the strong favorites for the title, as no team in recent memory had joined 3 players at the top of their stardom so suddenly. Meanwhile, the Orlando Magic quietly began to come alive, as they too benefited from the breakup of the Seattle Supersonics by signing Rashard Lewis. While the Magic wouldn't make contending noise that season, the summer of 2007 set up what the East would look like for the next few years, as the Cavaliers, Magic, Pistons, and Celtics made up the top half of the Eastern Conference. And then there was the Miami Heat, who would regress into oblivion as they completely blew up the team from 06, sending Shaquille O'Neal to the Suns. And if injuries hadn't broken them apart, the Eastern Conference would have been very interesting that year. So the season commenced as expected. The 08 Celtics dominated, but then they severely underperformed for the playoffs, allowing both the Hawks and Cavaliers to take them 7 games. With the talent on their roster and after having won 66 games, neither of those series were called for, but they got the job done and went to the NBA Finals after eliminating the Pistons. This would be Detroit's 6th straight Eastern Finals run, but also their last for the foreseeable future. By 2009, the East had taken the form of Orlando, Cleveland, and Boston. Very early on in that season, the Pistons sent Chauncey Billups to Denver for Allen Iverson, officially ending their bid in the Eastern Conference. Meanwhile, LeBron James had turned into an MVP, subsequently lifting the Cavaliers to real prominence. Dwight Howard had also risen to MVP level, nearly making the Magic a 60-win team. However, what truly cleared the path for these teams, at least temporarily, was Kevin Garnett sustaining an eventual season-ending knee injury that caused him to age in dog years. Boston was 44-12 at the time of the injury and still managed to win 62 games without him playing a major role the rest of the way. Still, with his backup also having sustained a knee injury, the Celtics just weren't the same, leaving the fate of the conference to the Magic and Cavaliers for that year. In an upset, the Magic ruined the LeBron and Kobe storyline in 6 games, only to be dismantled by the Mamba himself in the finals. It's widely believed that either the Magic or the Cavaliers were going to suffer that fate regardless. The 2010 season was basically just 2009 Part 2 as far as the Eastern Conference goes. The Celtics were a wounded warrior, but were still able to remain at the top half of the conference. Meanwhile, the Cavs and Magic had both made moves in an attempt to stay on top of them, dealing for Shaquille O'Neal and Vince Carter respectively. Nevertheless, the Celtics dealt a swift reminder to both of them that despite Garnett's injury, they were still there to dominate the conference for the foreseeable future by defeating them both, back-to-back in the playoffs. That was despite many injuries throughout the season, a slowed Kevin Garnett, and only having amassed 50 wins during the regular season. This was perhaps the biggest turning point in the Eastern Conference's evolution. With this having been the 3rd year of the Celtics' Big Three hanging around the top, LeBron decided that the job was never going to be done in Cleveland at that rate. Also, an important subplot here is that the Cavaliers refused to trade for Amar'e Stoudemire that season because it cost them what they thought was an important future piece if LeBron left. Thus, LeBron, Wade, and Bosh joined forces that summer to evolve what the Celtics had done 3 years earlier. The problem was, 2010 was one of the largest free agency classes ever, and very few other Eastern teams seriously benefited from that windfall. So the East was looking to be solely between Boston and Miami. The Bulls landed Carlos Boozer, who got hurt very early on, and the Knicks signed Amar'e Stoudemire to prepare to make a run at building their own Big Three. But out of nowhere that summer, Derrick Rose declared that he could become the league's MVP. While it was true that he'd had an amazing first postseason in 2009 and made some progress the following year, there were no indications that he was about to become the youngest MVP ever in a league where LeBron, Kobe, Dwight Howard, and other players like that were still at the top of their games. Then, in a story that has really become very underrated, he led the Bulls to 62 wins, better than both juggernauts in that conference between Boston and Miami. To round out the top 4, the Magic had severely regressed by swapping much of their core that had made 2 straight conference finals bids. The Knicks also made progress by dealing for Carmelo Anthony later in the season, and it was thought that they'd add Chris Paul soon after, so Maybe it wasn't exactly progress because they dealt so much of their roster to get Melo, and when Chris Paul never came, it really never worked out. Despite that, in 2011, the East really had 5 interesting teams, with about 3 that could realistically make the finals. However, Amar'e Stoudemire's career-altering injuries began right around this time, throwing a dagger in what he and Carmelo were supposed to be. The Celtics stupidly traded Kendrick Perkins, betting that Shaquille O'Neal would be good and healthy enough to get through the East, and those events wound up leaving the Eastern Conference in the hands of Miami and Chicago. Miami advanced, and that was the start of what was a very long vice grip on the East between them and LeBron. By 2012, Boston's better days were behind them. The Magic never got back to themselves, and the East had basically become a 2-man race between the Bulls and Heat, and depending on if you believed on the Knicks, maybe a 3-man race, but it was pretty well understood that it was probably the Heat. And then Derrick Rose, who was supposed to be a long-time challenger to LeBron in whatever team he was on, tears his ACL. That cracked the door open one more time for the Celtics, considering that Bosh had also gotten injured in those playoffs. Boston was close. They really could have broken up the Heat's big 3 right then and there with a Game 7 win. But Miami advanced and proved that their formula worked, winning their first title. That prompted Ray Allen to leave Boston and actually join Miami, which officially took the Celtics out of prominence in the East. In their place, the Knicks had built their strongest roster of the Carmelo Anthony era, and the Pacers emerged as a sleeper team when Paul George was officially given the keys to the Pacers offense. The Orlando Magic also officially bowed out by trading Dwight Howard to the Lakers that summer in a move that was supposed to have created the most unstoppable super team of all time. With Derrick Rose unwilling to return in the 2013 season, despite how the Knicks looked, common opinion was that nobody had a chance against the Heat in the East. Not only did they have a supercharged roster, but LeBron was having his best season and one of the greatest in history. Also, the Knicks were upset by the Pacers, and although they went on to give Miami a good fight, it really felt like they were a result of the power vacuum created by Rose's injury. It was an X-Man up type situation, and they did put up a great fight. Nonetheless, the Pacers built on that opportunity to become the best in the conference in 2014. Even when the Heat and Pacers would play, the marketing was built around Paul George and LeBron dueling for the throne in the East. The Raptors and Wizards' young core had slowly begun to develop and look like future threats, and the Nets tried their hand in super team territory by trading their entire future for what was left of Paul Pierce and Garnett. Their starting 5 actually looked ridiculous on paper, but Brook Lopez got injured pretty much immediately, and by the end of that season, Kevin Garnett was missing layups at the rim. There was some faint hope that they'd match Miami just because of the names, but they never really got close aside from sweeping them in the season series. Derrick Rose's comeback that year lasted only a few games, therefore the East was again a 2-man race that ended with the Heat chasing Indiana out of town. That's the summer where there was some major implications for the future of the East. LeBron left back for Cleveland after being dominated by the Spurs, and Paul George broke his leg during a Team USA scrimmage. That was insanely important to the evolution of the Eastern Conference because George's Pacers were the fill-in for Rose's Bulls. Losing George not only meant losing yet another star in that conference at a crucial time, but it also ended the Pacers' progression under his reign. Also by this point, the Knicks had completely fallen out of contention after Carmelo Anthony re-signed, and they did nothing to really improve the roster significantly to make it a contender. So with the newest power vacuum, a pretending Hawks team popped up that had multiple All-Stars with no All-NBA players. The Raptors and Wizards continued to inch forward. Meanwhile, a very young sleeper team was emerging as the Bucks made the playoffs with Giannis for the first time. They weren't yet a threat, but people instantly looked at Giannis and realized he was going to be a problem in the coming years. The Miami Heat were pretty enthusiastic as well, but injuries immediately took them off the board as a threat. Regardless, it was very well understood that Chicago, with what was left of MVP Rose and Pau Gasol joining, was the only true challenger left to Cleveland. They gave a decent 6-game series, but other than that, Cleveland easily advanced to the finals where what was left of them got injured. By 2016, LeBron and the Cavs had a chokehold on the conference. The Miami Heat again were removed from contention by injury. Derrick Rose started the season with one eye in what ended up being a lost year, and Paul George had returned to a decimated Pacers team. With most of the serious stars of the conference having been injured or surrounded by some inferior supporting cast, the rest of the true stars were really on the Cavaliers. The only team left to pose a threat were the Raptors, and 2016 was just the first step in LeBronto. The Cavs would easily advance to their improbable 2016 win, but in hindsight, it kind of stuck a nail in their future. The calendar flipped to 2017, and it was more of the same except for the seeds that had officially been planted. The Raptors' core improved, the Celtics reappeared on the map after being led back to prominence by Isaiah Thomas and additions such as Al Horford. The Wizards also appeared to be making serious strides with John Wall looking like the best point guard in the East, and the Bucks were now officially in the mix to stay. With that being said, the Celtics were probably the weakest one seed in the East since the early 2000s. The Cavaliers lost a whopping total of 1 game in the East as they advanced to yet another NBA Finals, where they lost to a Warriors team that they inadvertently created by defeating the year before. By 2018, however, the East had begun to show signs of life and the power was diluted. In his pursuit to run his own team, and probably also to avoid the looming disaster in Cleveland, Kyrie requested out, subsequently landing him in Boston. This saw him team up with Gordon Hayward, who Isaiah Thomas had convinced to sign that summer shortly after being traded. That probably explains the karma. The Raptors core had matured to the tune that they'd basically won 60 games. All at once, it came together in Philly as they went from a tanking team with constant injuries to a 52-win team in a 3rd seed. The Pacers ended the PG era by shipping him off for Victor Oladipo. And the Bucks, although on the outskirts of the situation, had seen Giannis turn into what was an obvious future MVP. And for the first time in around 6 years, it was seen as a legitimate possibility that LeBron could lose in the East. This resulted in one of the weirdest playoff storylines ever. First off, Hayward immediately went down with a gruesome injury that still has repercussions on Boston today. The Cavaliers totally changed their roster as, coming into the season, they were basically a concoction of players past their prime, but overall still looked kind of deep on paper. When that didn't work out, they swapped everybody for what they thought were good young future pieces. And by the time the playoffs started, Kyrie Irving was also out with knee surgery, so the Celtics seemed depleted. It essentially left the headless Boston team to fend for itself, and they did so by ripping through both the Bucks and the Sixers in an unexpected twist of events. That led them back to LeBron, who'd barely gotten his Cavaliers team past an up-and-coming Pacers before a short stop in Lebronto. That once again crossed the paths of LeBron and Boston, and he narrowly led Cleveland by in a 7-game series that saw him advance to his 8th straight finals. Problem was, by that point, the Cavs seemed gridlocked. They could no longer even get close to passing the Warriors and didn't have a ton of flexibility to make that a reality in the near future. With that, and LeBron feeling as if he had nothing left to prove, he left the Eastern Conference to go make movies in Los Angeles. That left the biggest power vacuum in the Eastern Conference since Michael Jordan retired, and teams were all over it. It's at this part that it should be acknowledged that the following events were probably coming anyways. The Cavaliers had bad contracts and not a lot of talent, so it's not all that likely they were about to become some immovable juggernaut again. Thus, the Bucks surrounded Giannis with shooters, propelling them to become the best team in the conference. The Raptors took their developed core and switched out an assault rifle for a nuclear warhead by trading for Kawhi Leonard. The Sixers made no moves until the season started and then wound up with 4-star level players, even if it only lasts for this season. The Pacers made major strides. As a matter of fact, they were the best sleeper team we'd seen in quite some time until Oladipo went down with a devastating injury. And then the Celtics, those good old Celtics. In theory, they were supposed to be a juggernaut. On paper, their talent was unmatched in the conference. But sometimes less is more. And from where things sit now, it's entirely possible that this team, having been exposed to not having a star player, then having to try to reincorporate 2 of them, was the worst thing that could have happened. The 2019 season saw Toronto and Milwaukee take their places at the top, while Philly and Boston seemed to be the biggest losers in what was supposed to be their conference to rule for years to come. The Celtics have gone from being dominated by one freak of nature straight into the wrath of another in a torment that seems to have no end to it. Philadelphia just fell victim to Kawhi Leonard in the most inhumane way possible, and the Sixers are now left to ponder what to do with their future. There's no assurance that Tobias Harris or Jimmy Butler intend to come back, and Ben Simmons has yet to make any progress on his jump shot that would have probably significantly helped them in this series. The Pacers were looking to become the 5th team in what would have made the Eastern Conference maybe the strongest it's ever been, but Oladipo's future now remains uncertain. And the same goes for John Wall, a very bright star whose future is now up in the air after an Achilles injury, and his team's future is left up in the air after many years of trying to develop into a contender. The only sure thing at this exact moment seems to be that Giannis has taken his place on the Eastern Conference's throne. There are no assurances Kawhi Leonard intends to stay, but assuming that he did, it's a throne they may battle for in the years to come. Nobody truly knows where the East is headed, but it seems like the darkest days may be over, and the most competitive ones may have yet to even come.